the solutions are out there. There is real solutions to these problems.
Behind palace smiles and carefully staged appearances, a worry has begun to surface. William and Catherine, usually guarded with their children's world, have now confirmed news that no parent ever wants to share. Little Louis, known for his laughter and playful waves, has become the center of hushed conversations and anxious glances, all unfolding under the public eye. So, what changed behind closed doors? What truth forced this rare admission? And why does this moment feel like a turning point that could reshape the family's future forever? Stay with us, because what unfolds next will shock you. William and Catherine confirm the tragic news. It didn't arrive wrapped in ceremony or softened by tradition. The confirmation came plainly, quietly, and that was what made it devastating. Prince William and Catherine didn't allow the palace to speak for them this time. They stepped forward themselves and confirmed that something deeply serious had happened to Prince Louis. Not a rumor, not a misinterpretation, not a situation still being assessed. It was real, and it was already unfolding. What stunned observers wasn't only what was confirmed, but how it was done. No senior aide, no carefully distanced royal spokesperson. Instead, the message came directly from Louis's parents, stripped of the usual institutional padding that turns royal crises into abstract headlines. This wasn't a monarchy addressing the public. It was a mother and father doing something far more difficult, acknowledging a tragedy involving their child. The tone told its own story. Calm, measured, and unmistakably heavy. There was no urgency meant to reassure, no optimistic phrasing designed to buy time. The words were restrained, but they carried a weight that felt final. Royal watchers immediately noticed what wasn't there. No promises of quick recovery, no timelines, no language suggesting this was a temporary disruption. Instead, the confirmation settled into a space of acceptance, as though the hardest conversations had already taken place behind closed doors. That distinction mattered. This wasn't speculation spilling out ahead of the facts. It was the facts catching up to the public. William and Catherine weren't reacting to rumors, they were preempting them. And by choosing to speak as parents rather than representatives of the crown, they signaled that whatever Louis was facing had crossed a line where protocol no longer came first. The confirmation didn't spell out every detail, and it didn't need to. The gravity was in the framing. It acknowledged a profound change in Louis's life and, by extension, the life of the family. This wasn't a momentary setback. It was an acknowledgement that something had shifted, possibly permanently, and that the world would now have to recalibrate its expectations. Within minutes, the message began to echo far beyond palace gates. But at its core, this chapter of the story is simple and unavoidable. William and Catherine confirmed tragic news about their youngest son, deliberately and without disguise. They chose clarity over comfort, truth over insulation, and by doing so, they drew a hard line between rumor and reality. Yet even as the confirmation landed, it raised an unsettling question that lingered in the silence that followed. If this was all they were willing to say now, what were they deliberately not saying yet? Let's find out. The statement that set off alarm bells. The confirmation itself was shocking, but it was the language of the statement that truly unsettled those who knew how to read between royal lines. Seasoned royal reporters didn't need leaks or insider tips to sense danger. The alarm bells rang the moment they noticed what the statement refused to say. In the royal world, omission is never accidental, Every word is weighed, every silence is intentional, and this silence was deafening. There were no phrases typically deployed to calm the public, no responding well, no precautionary measures, no carefully chosen assurances that suggest a clear path forward. Even the soft cushions of hope, expressions like in good spirits or expected to resume normal activities, were nowhere to be found. For journalists accustomed to decoding palace language, that absence was chilling. It signaled that optimism could not be responsibly offered. Timing also mattered. The statement arrived without the usual build-up, without coordinated background briefings or follow-up guidance. Newsrooms were left holding a single tightly constructed message and nothing else. That alone caused unease. When the palace believes a situation is manageable, it controls the rhythm of information. Here, there was no rhythm, just a sudden drop of gravity and a vacuum that followed. Royal correspondents reacted almost instinctively. On air, several paused mid-sentence, visibly recalibrating their tone. Commentators, who had covered generations of royal health announcements, quietly acknowledged they had never seen wording quite like this. Analysts noted that the statement didn't aim to steady emotions. It acknowledged them. That distinction suggested something had already reached a point beyond reassurance. Perhaps most telling was the lack of future orientation. Royal statements usually look ahead, even cautiously. They hint at next steps, next appearances, next updates. This one didn't. There was no reference to upcoming engagements, no suggestion of temporary withdrawal, no indication of when the public might see Prince Louis again. That omission transformed concern into fear. It implied that planning ahead was no longer possible or no longer appropriate. Experts also pointed to the emotional neutrality of the language. It wasn't dramatic, but it wasn't hopeful either. Instead, it carried the tone of acceptance. Analysts described it as the language used when a family has already absorbed difficult qissad, realities, and is now preparing others to do the same. That's when speculation shifted from what is happening to how long has this been happening? The statement didn't just inform, it destabilized. By offering clarity without comfort, it invited interpretation. And in the absence of reassurance, the public did what it always does. It filled the gaps. Questions multiplied. Rumors surfaced. Comparisons were drawn. Not because the palace was careless, but because the language left no emotional anchor to hold on to. This wasn't the wording of a temporary disruption. It felt deliberate, restrained, and conclusive. And once that realization took hold, the reaction was inevitable. The statement had done its job in confirming the truth, but it had also opened the door to something far louder. But once silence gave way to uncertainty, how would the world respond? Don't blink. Keep watching. Public shock, media frenzy, and online speculation. The moment the statement went public, disbelief swept through the audience faster than any official analysis could follow. People didn't argue with what William and Catherine had confirmed. They struggled to absorb it. The shock wasn't loud at first. It was quiet, heavy, and confused. Parents paused mid-scroll. Comment sections filled not with theories, but with stunned questions. How could this happen? Why now? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how serious is serious? Grief arrived almost immediately, even without details. That alone spoke volumes. The public reaction wasn't driven by scandal or outrage. It was driven by fear. This wasn't about royal politics or privilege. It was about a child many had watched grow up in fragments. Small waves from palace balconies, fleeting smiles at public events. The idea that something tragic could interrupt that innocence hit a nerve far beyond Britain. Newsrooms felt the impact just as sharply. Anchors recalibrated their tone in real time, abandoning prepared segments to accommodate breaking coverage they hadn't anticipated. Royal correspondents scrambled for context, replaying the statement repeatedly, analyzing each sentence for meaning. Yet there was a problem. There was nothing to clarify. The palace had offered confirmation, not explanation. That left journalists with an unfamiliar task, reporting certainty without detail. Almost instantly, comparisons surfaced. Veteran commentators drew cautious parallels to other moments when royal silence had preceded seismic change. Not because the situations were identical, but because the emotional rhythm felt familiar. The same sudden stillness, the same absence of reassurance, the same sense that something irreversible had already occurred before the public was allowed to know. These comparisons weren't declarations, they were reflections of collective memory. Online, the reactions splintered. Social media became a mosaic of emotion. Some users urged restraint and compassion, reminding others that this involved a minor. Others began asking harder questions, not accusations, but why questions. Why had there been no signs? Why now? Why speak this way if there was still hope? The speculation didn't invent facts. It circled the unknown, probing the gaps left by the statement. Rumors inevitably emerged, but so did self-policing. Many users pushed back against exaggeration, calling for patience and responsibility. This wasn't misinformation running wild, it was uncertainty searching for structure. Fans of the royal family, critics of the institution, and casual observers found themselves strangely aligned, unsettled by the same silence. Emotionally, the public split in two directions. One side leaned into grief, interpreting the tone as preparation for worse news ahead. The other clung to the belief that the lack of detail meant privacy, not permanence. Both camps agreed on one thing: the statement didn't feel temporary. That shared perception fueled the intensity of the discussion. What made the moment combustible was not outrage, but empathy mixed with fear. People projected their own experiences, missed signs, quiet children, moments they wished they'd noticed sooner. Prince Louis became less a royal figure and more a symbol of vulnerability under pressure. By the end of the first day, the narrative had slipped beyond the palace's immediate control, not because of lies, but because silence invites interpretation. The public wasn't demanding answers yet, but it was bracing for them. And as the media struggled to keep pace with an audience emotionally ahead of the facts, one truth became clear. This wasn't just a royal announcement anymore. It was a collective reckoning, and the palace could feel it building. But if the public was already bracing for impact, what was happening behind the palace walls? Stay tuned. Inside the palace, as damage control began, behind the stillness of the public statement, the palace was anything but calm. What the world saw as restraint was, in reality, the result of hours of frantic deliberation behind closed doors. Aides weren't simply polishing language, they were wrestling with consequences. Every sentence had been drafted, scrapped, and redrafted again. Not because the facts were unclear, but because the weight of saying too much felt just as dangerous as saying too little. Inside the palace, two priorities collided head-on. One, was compassion, protecting Prince Louis, and honoring the gravity of what William and Catherine were facing as parents. The other was optics, managing an institution built on continuity, stability, and controlled disclosure. Those priorities had coexisted uneasily for generations, but now they were in open conflict. This wasn't a routine crisis that could be contained with protocol. It was personal, and that made control far more fragile. The first objective was simple: slow the momentum. Not stop it, just slow it. Palace aides understood immediately that speculation was inevitable. The goal became limiting escalation without offering fresh material for interpretation. That's why the statement was brief. That's why medical terminology was avoided. That's why no spokesperson stepped forward to elaborate. Silence, they hoped, would act as a buffer rather than an accelerant. But silence has consequences of its own. Within newsrooms, the lack of follow-up guidance was read as hesitation. Inside the palace, it was strategy. Staff were instructed to hold the line. No background briefings, no anonymous clarifications, no off-the-record reassurance. Even longtime correspondents, who usually received quiet context, were left waiting. This wasn't about secrecy, it was about containment. Tension grew as reports filtered back from the outside world. Media coverage was intensifying, not calming. Social platforms were filling the gaps faster than expected. And inside the palace, a troubling realization set in. The statement had confirmed the truth, but it had not anchored it. Without reassurance, the narrative was drifting. Emergency meetings followed. Not dramatic confrontations, but strained discussions marked by pauses and unfinished sentences. How much truth was too much? At what point did protection begin to look like evasion? Advisors disagreed. Some argued that further clarification would humanize the situation. Others warned that any additional detail could spiral beyond control once released. What complicated everything was timing. The crisis, insiders knew, hadn't just emerged. It had been building quietly, long before the public became aware. That meant there was history, footage, appearances, moments now being re-examined. Damage control wasn't just about the present. It was about the past suddenly being reframed in real time. Even palace staff weren't fully insulated. Some reportedly learned the full scope of the situation only hours before the statement went public. Their shock was genuine. This wasn't a rehearsed operation. It was a system reacting under pressure, trying to recalibrate without precedent. The usual tools of royal management, routine, hierarchy, distance, felt inadequate. This wasn't a scandal to outweight or a controversy to redirect. It was a family crisis unfolding inside an institution that thrives on predictability. And for the first time in a long while, predictability wasn't available. By the end of that first day, one thing was clear inside palace walls. Control was no longer guaranteed. The statement had done what it was meant to do, confirm the reality. But it had also exposed how narrow the margin had become. Every next step carried risk. Every silence invited more questions. And as advisors debated what could be said versus what should be protected, the palace found itself reacting, not leading. So when control finally slipped inside the palace, who would step forward and what cost? Keep watching. William breaks protocol as a father. After days of mounting pressure, media noise, and unanswered questions, the moment arrived that no palace advisor could have scripted. Prince William stepped forward, not as the heir, not as the steady public figure trained to absorb crisis, but as a father who could no longer stay behind the shield of royal distance. What followed wasn't a speech in the traditional sense. It was an admission. There was no podium, no ceremonial framing, no carefully staged reassurance. When William spoke, his composure wavered almost immediately. The restraint that had defined the earlier confirmation cracked, and in that fracture, something deeply human emerged. Those watching could tell instantly this was not about managing headlines anymore. This was about confronting regret. William didn't begin with formality or gratitude. He began with a confession that stunned even seasoned royal observers. "I should have seen it sooner." In one sentence, decades of royal insulation dissolved. He acknowledged that the signs had been there, quietly accumulating over time, and that he had missed them. Not because he didn't care, but because palace life has a way of disguising reality beneath routine, obligation, and expectation. He spoke of months filled with subtle changes, Prince Louis growing quieter, withdrawing in ways that were easy to explain away as phases, moments that, in hindsight, carried more weight than they seemed at the time. William admitted that the structure meant to protect his family had also distracted him. Duties continued, engagements went on, and within that constant motion, the emotional shift inside his own home became harder to recognize. The guilt was unmistakable. William described sleepless nights spent pacing palace corridors, replaying moments he wished he could relive differently. How could he be so attentive to national responsibilities, yet so slow to see what was unfolding with his youngest son? The question haunted him, and it showed. This wasn't controlled vulnerability. It was exhaustion finally given a voice. Then came the moment that changed everything. William paused, visibly struggling, before sharing a question Prince Louis had asked him. It was simple, quiet, and devastating. "Do I have to smile when I don't feel it?" That question, William admitted, cut through every layer of denial he had been holding on to. It wasn't mischief. It wasn't rebellion. It was a child asking for permission to stop pretending. In that instant, William said, the truth became unavoidable. The expectations surrounding Louis, spoken and unspoken, had become heavier than anyone realized. The effort to shield him from pressure had, paradoxically, isolated him further. William acknowledged this plainly, admitting that in trying to protect his son from the world, they had built walls that made it harder to truly see him. The admission didn't stop there. William spoke about how the strain had rippled through the family. The balance between George, Charlotte, and Louis had shifted. Catherine had tried to hold everything together. Charlotte had grown quietly watchful. The household had changed, even if no one wanted to name it. What began as concern had slowly become something deeper and more dangerous. For the public, this moment marked the collapse of royal distance. The familiar separation between private pain and public image vanished. This was not the language of monarchy. It was the language of a parent reckoning with missed moments and irreversible consequences. By choosing honesty over composure, William crossed a line the institution rarely allows. And once crossed, there was no returning to scripted restraint. His words didn't calm the situation, but they clarified it. Whatever Prince Louis was facing, it was serious enough to break centuries of instinct to remain guarded. And as William stepped back from the spotlight, one truth lingered heavily in the air. If a future king was willing to expose this level of regret, the crisis had already gone far beyond what protocol could contain. But if William's honesty shattered protocol, how did that crisis ripple through the rest of the family? Let's look closer to find out. When the crisis spread through the family, what began as a struggle, centered on Prince Louis, did not stay contained for long. Behind palace walls, the weight of his struggle quietly seeped into every corner of the household. There were no loud arguments or visible breakdowns, just a slow, invisible shift that carried devastating impact. Princess Charlotte was the first to absorb it, not because anyone asked her to, but because she instinctively stepped into the space left by her withdrawn brother. At public moments, she stood closer to him, held his hand when cameras turned away, whispered softly when he grew still. What had once seemed like a sweet sibling bond was now a heavy responsibility. Charlotte had become a quiet buffer, carrying emotions she didn't fully understand, but felt compelled to manage. Catherine initially interpreted Charlotte's behavior, maturity, and strength. It wasn't until later that the cost became clear. One quiet afternoon, Charlotte stopped speaking, not in defiance, but from exhaustion. When Catherine asked what was wrong, Charlotte whispered, "I didn't want you to worry more." In that moment, Catherine understood the gravity of what had been unfolding. The children were no longer just affected. They were managing the emotional burden themselves. Louis continued to withdraw. He lost interest in school, in play, in the small joys of childhood. His laughter faded, and his once bright energy diminished gradually but painfully. Catherine watched as Charlotte tried every day to bring back her brother's spark through games, songs, and quiet company. Nothing worked, and slowly, Charlotte herself began to show signs of strain. The family dynamic shifted subtly but profoundly. George grew more serious and observant. Catherine carried the constant tension of keeping the household together while realizing the quiet suffering had extended beyond Louis. The home ran on routine, but emotionally, it felt suffocating. Silence, meant to protect, had become the family's enemy. There were no dramatic confrontations to mark the breaking point. Instead, the realization grew steadily. This was no longer about one child. Louis's struggle was affecting every relationship in the home, quietly reshaping the family. The attempt to shield him from exposure had inadvertently allowed the emotional toll to spread, touching George, Charlotte, and even the parents in ways they hadn't anticipated. This chapter of the story isn't about blame. It's about how love, when carried alone, can become weight. Charlotte's quiet collapse was the clearest signal yet that the family could not continue in silence. The crisis had become collective. For Catherine, this understanding shattered any remaining illusion that the situation was manageable. Protecting Louis through privacy and routine was no longer sufficient. The silence that had once seemed protective was now dangerous, and with that realization came the understanding that the next decision, the one that would follow in secret, would alter everything, not just for Louis, but for the entire family. The quiet suffering of Louis and Charlotte had become undeniable. The family could no longer hold it in alone, and the palace, once thought to contain the crisis, now faced the reality that the emotional impact had already spread far beyond a single child. But when silence finally failed, What secret decision pushed everything past the point of no return? Don't blink. Keep watching. The fallout the palace couldn't contain. The breaking point didn't come from the public. It came from inside the institution itself. Just as the palace was struggling to steady the narrative, a confidential document surfaced, one never meant to be seen beyond closed doors. Its language was cold, strategic, and devastatingly detached. Prince Louis was no longer framed as a child in distress, but as a risk to be managed. Phrases centered on visibility, containment, and reputational exposure replaced any mention of care or concern. And once that mindset became visible, control was lost. The clash inside the palace was immediate. For William, reading the document felt like a betrayal disguised as administration. The fury that followed was not performative. He rejected the premise outright, that his son could be reduced to a problem to be minimized. Catherine's response was quieter but sharper. She confronted senior advisors directly, placing the document before them and asking a single disarming question. Would you speak this way if it were your child? There was no answer, because there wasn't one that could survive the moment. Princess Anne, already closely involved, refused to let the issue fade. She recognized the pattern, legacy being placed above life, and she pushed back hard. Calls were made, lines were crossed. For once, protocol yielded to responsibility. The family closed ranks, not as an institution, but as parents and relatives, unwilling to let silence do more damage. When excerpts of the document reached the public, the reaction was swift and unforgiving. Headlines condemned the palace's tone. Commentators called it a moral failure. Mental health organizations issued pointed statements criticizing the dehumanizing language and warning against treating emotional recovery as a public relations liability. Social media, already tense, erupted. This wasn't gossip anymore. It was outrage, grounded in empathy. What made the backlash so powerful was its clarity. The public didn't misunderstand the palace's intent. They recognized it, and they rejected it. For the first time in years, the monarchy wasn't defending itself against scandal, but against its own machinery. The institution's instinct to manage had collided with a moment that demanded care. Faced with mounting pressure, the palace was forced to respond differently. A new statement followed, measured, direct, and unmistakably human. It acknowledged that Prince Louis was receiving ongoing emotional recovery support. No euphemisms, no deflection, just truth. Catherine's influence was evident, underscored by a personal note that thanked the public for patience and admitted that some truths could only be shared when they were ready to be held. That was the moment the palace lost narrative control, and something else took its place. Empathy, understanding. The institution could no longer dictate the story. It had to listen to it, and in doing so, it crossed a threshold it could never fully return from. The fallout wasn't just reputational, it was transformational. The attempt to contain the crisis exposed a system unprepared for vulnerability, and once exposed, it could no longer pretend strength meant silence. Breaking generational trend. What makes this moment so unsettling isn't only what happened to Prince Louis, but how familiar the pattern feels. For generations, the royal family has relied on silence as protection, absorbing pain privately, maintaining composure publicly, and trusting time to smooth what honesty might complicate. It worked before, or at least it appeared to. But history tells a quieter truth. Princesses and princes before Louis carried struggles behind palace walls, often at great personal cost, while the institution pressed forward untouched. This time, something shifted. William and Catherine didn't abandon tradition lightly. They confronted it. In choosing openness over containment, they challenged a system shaped by precedent rather than empathy. The echoes are impossible to ignore. From Diana's unheard warnings and later fractures within the family, the consequences of emotional neglect have surfaced again and again. What's different now is the refusal to repeat that cycle unquestioned. Prince Louis's story didn't expose weakness, it exposed a crossroads. One path follows the old way: quiet endurance, controlled appearances, and unresolved harm. The other risks honesty, vulnerability, and change. The palace may not have chosen that second path willingly, but it was pushed there by reality. And that may be the most consequential legacy of this moment. Not tragedy alone, but the possibility that the next generation of royals will be allowed to feel, struggle, and heal without having to disappear in silence to do so. So, what do you think happens when tradition clashes with honesty? Can the royal family finally break the cycle of silence and pain? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to comment below.